My martial art is too deadly for the ring. If somebody tries to attack me, I'll gouge the eyes, rip the groin, break the neck. This is the streets. It's fight to survive. Yeah, that all sounds great, and it could probably do some real damage to somebody, but what happens afterwards when you're in front of the judge explaining why you did what you did? Well, Your Honor, you see he grabbed me by the wrist, so I thought it would be appropriate to gouge his eyes out and leave him in a pool of his own blood. Now, there's a chance the judge might buy that, but after you pay all your hefty attorney's fees and spend all of your days in court, you have to ask yourself, was it really worth it? And at this point, I have to ask, should martial arts be teaching you lethal self-defense techniques in the first place? Before we go any further, let's clarify what we mean when we say lethal self-defense techniques. Because anything can be lethal if you do it wrong enough, or right enough if you ask the wrong person. No, I'm talking about moves and sequences whose express purpose is to cripple, maim, or murder your opponent, with no real way to scale down for safety. So stuff like stomp kicks to a downed opponent, gouges of any kind, and of course the wonderful world of knife fighting. That's what we're talking about when we say lethal martial arts. Oh, and by the way, for the purpose of this conversation right now, we're going to view every martial art as equally dangerous. Everything works. Everything from Bagua to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Whether or not you agree that's true, that's how we're going to have this conversation. The thing is, not all martial arts are created the same. Some styles were invented for you to be able to defend yourself in non-consensual, violent situations. Other martial arts are a sport where you're willingly trading hands with another human being. And others still are battlefield styles meant to be used when weapons fail you. That's 3 different intentions, all being called the same thing. The problem is, when you call something designed for warfare self-defense, you end up with a very skewed perspective of what self-defense actually is. Self-defense laws vary from state to state, so this definition is going to be far from universal. But in Texas, self-defense is described as appropriate use of force when illegal use of force is being used against you or others. In other words, if someone comes up to you threatening you with a bat, you can use your martial arts training in self-defense to make them stop. And an appropriate use of force would be pinning them to the ground and then holding them in place until they agree to calm down. An inappropriate use of force would be forcibly taking the bat from their hand and then beating their brains in. The situation may have started as self-defense, but it ended with you committing assault with a deadly weapon. But what does this have to do with martial arts? No, you don't actually have to register yourself as a deadly weapon once you become a black belt, but you are being held to a higher standard than the untrained person would be. You know more, so you have to restrain more. Now, of course, martial artists have the right to defend themselves as much as anybody else does, but as the old saying goes, better to check rather than hurt rather than maim, and maim rather than kill. And a trained martial artist should be able to do each and every one of those way better than the untrained person.
But Rob, if someone attacks me, I won't know how much danger I'm in until it's too late. And if I make the wrong choice, I could end up dead.
First of all, there's plenty of ways to restrain and or get away from someone that don't involve brutally murdering them. If your dojo isn't teaching you a tiered curriculum of techniques, find a different dojo. Second of all, part of martial arts training is learning how to assess in a split second how dangerous someone actually is. The 120-pound soccer mom sparring for the first time might be trying to take my head off, but I'm not going to handle her the same way I would handle the amateur heavyweight boxer. Now, of course, in self-defense, you don't have nearly as much information on your attacker, and the results for being wrong about their threat level can be disastrous, but the exercise is the same. And that's the point of training in the first place. Learning at a low stakes how to handle yourself at a high stakes situation. If your only response to a drunk lazily throwing a haymaker at you is to kick their legs out and crush their windpipe, that's not self-defense, that's second-degree manslaughter.
Oh, it's a deer. It's coming right for us!
But now the question becomes, why do we even have lethal martial arts techniques? The simple answer is LARPing, which sounds like I'm saying it derogatively, but I'm actually not. The fact of the matter is, a lot of people come to the martial arts to try and preserve classical battlefield martial arts that may not necessarily be appropriate in today's day and age. Now, it can be cool to study ancient jiu-jitsu techniques for historical preservation, but it's also important to remember there was a time and a place when those things were appropriate, and that time isn't necessarily now. But on the other hand, there are of course plenty of examples of martial arts instructors who are just trying to seem badass in front of their students, and demonstrating lethal martial arts techniques certainly brings that wow factor. The problem is, this is still just role-playing. Only now, this guy's role-playing the role of a super soldier fighting against a non-resisting opponent. And the problem there is not the false confidence it instills in the students, although that can be an issue, but instead the lack of responsibility on the part of the instructor. I believe the role of a martial arts instructor is not just teaching how to do techniques, but also understanding the when and the why. And if the answer to when and why is never under any circumstances, then why are you teaching people it in the first place? Now, we could of course make the argument that you sometimes do techniques just for fun, but if we're trying to teach people self-defense, that can't be the end goal. And now I'd like to give a shout out to today's sponsor, X Martial. X Martial does more for the community than any brand out there. They sponsor over 300 athletes of all levels and help kids along their martial arts journey. They have given away over $10,000 worth of gear in 2023 alone.
That's actually fun. I like doing this. This is so fun.
So now is the time to shop with X Martial as they have some amazing deals. Be sure to use promo code COMBATSD for 10% off. On that note, let's talk about weapons real quick. Obviously, if you're carrying a gun, you have one, maybe two ways of handling a situation. Either A, you're ready to do the deed and blast your opponent away, or B, you're hoping the threat of lethality scares them enough into getting them to back down. But either way, there's no such thing as less lethal gun training. If you're carrying a gun, you need to be willing to shoot the gun. If not, it's not really all that useful to you. But what if you're carrying a stick or a knife? Well, first of all, I want to make it very clear, if you're brandishing a weapon of any kind, stick, knife, or gun, you are escalating the situation and putting yourself on the back foot legally. So look out for that. But with that out of the way, why would you bring a knife to a fist fight? Well, because you're losing and you want to even the playing field. So you utilize the Filipino martial arts you've been working so hard on and start to slash away at your opponent. Trouble is, as Armchair Violence pointed out in this video right here, slashing is really only as useful as your knife is long and durable. And given the fact that most people are walking around with a 2 to 5 inch pocket folder, that's not exactly the strongest knife of all time. So slashing is out as a useful tactic. So instead, we have to rely on stabs for the stopping power. But the problem with stabbing is, the more you do it, the more likely your opponent is to die. And I don't know if I've made this point clear enough yet, killing people is not self-defense. So now this puts us in a very awkward situation, where fighting with a knife is objectively cool and very fun to do, but the times where it's both legally permissible and actually effective are virtually zero. That's why for me, knife fighting is really more of a tool to teach hand-to-hand fighting, as well as the risk of what can happen if someone draws a knife on you. But if you still want to get all the benefits of fighting with a knife, I recommend swapping out the blade for something like a kubaton, or as I prefer, the tactical pen. In this case, we're talking about the Atomic Bear Stealth Pen Pro, which I believe is the best tactical pen on the market, but any tactical pen is better than none. This one has some handy little teeth at the end of it, which you can still drive into your opponent and elicit pain, but they're not so sharp they're gonna puncture a lung or sever an artery. But back to the point I was making. There's a whole host of reasons for lethal martial arts techniques to exist, but the justification for using them gets smaller and smaller every day. Now, there's a very big elephant in the room that we've been ignoring that we should probably talk about now. Is it even possible to pull all these techniques in the real world against resisting opponents? Now, this question is kind of hard to answer without pissing off a whole bunch of people, but I've never cared about that before, and I'm not gonna start now. The short answer is no. Your Krav Maga Screama is not strong enough to pull off in the real world. But the long answer is still no, but for different reasons. Because the fact is, these techniques are too dangerous to practice in the real world. As in, you can't really practice ripping out someone's throat. At best, you can simulate it in slow motion with a partner or against a non-resisting dummy, but there's no real way to practice it and see how it works under scrutiny. And if you can't pressure test your technique under scrutiny, you can't actually rely on it in the real world. So now we're in a really awkward situation where we've learned a whole bunch of self-defense techniques that do work in a vacuum, but you can't practice realistically enough to be able to depend on them in the real world, which is the opposite of why you learn martial arts in the first place. But for the sake of argument, let's envision a world where you can practice lethal self-defense techniques realistically and safely enough to actually learn how to depend on them in the real world. Do you know what happens when you try to do a backbreaker in the real world? You go to prison, and going to prison is very bad self-defense. Any way you slice it, these techniques are high risk for very low reward. And if your concern is self-defense, that ratio really should be the other way around. Bottom line, the overlapping Venn diagram of martial arts for murder and martial arts for self-defense is very small. And there's of course a third circle which says martial arts is for fun, and that complicates the whole damn thing. Martial arts for self-defense is tricky. You of course have the right to protect yourself by any means you see fit, but what you see fit can be just as detrimental to your health and well-being as getting attacked or murdered. So have a few different options in your back pocket. Is it cool to know how to throw someone over your head and have them land in such a way that could break their neck? Yeah, absolutely. Is it fun to do 50 different knife cuts in under 10 seconds? Yeah, that's badass. But is it self-defense? Almost never. And it's time we stop pretending like it is.